Hi, Noel scientist, Miss Rose here. Today we're going to talk about one of the leading parasitic diseases in the world. I know you guys have heard of viruses and you've heard of bacteria, but maybe you haven't heard of parasites. Parasites are things that have to live within other things because they can't survive alone. They have to depend on other living things so that they can suck the life out of other living things and use their organs and their organelles and their energy to do their work. So the disease we're going to talk about today is called schistosomiasis. Has anybody ever heard of schistosomiasis? Probably not, because it's not a disease that's prevalent in the United States. In fact, it's very, 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 very rare to find a person in the United States with schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis is a disease largely of the African continent. So what does that have to do with the United States history? Well, interestingly enough, we're discussing right now the Middle Passage and Triangle Trade and the capture and deportation of thousands of Africans to the United States to enslave Africans to work in the United States. And so as we see slaves come over through the Middle Passage, and we're discussing and learning about the conditions in which the slaves traveled across the Middle Passage, we find out that they brought with them the diseases they had in Africa, and one of them was schistosomiasis. We're going to learn about schistosomiasis today. It's a very interesting parasitic infection, and it has several life stages, just like you do. You're born as a baby. Well, first you live inside your mother's womb, and then you come out and you're born as a baby, and then you become a toddler, and then you become a preteen and a teen and an adult and then a middle-aged person and then an older person, and you die. And the same is true for the parasite that causes schistosomiasis. So we're going to take a look at that, the life cycle, and what the disease does to people. But it's interesting to note that even today we see that when people travel between continents, they bring with them the diseases that they have. And we know this when we look at COVID-19. Which started in China and then quickly spread throughout Asia and Europe and then North America, South America, throughout the world, because people carry on their bodies whatever diseases they have, and then they can infect others. So although you will not find schistosomiasis in the United States very prevalent, you can find it from time to time. And that's why when people present to the emergency room or to their doctor with these unique symptoms that really look like schistosomiasis, sometimes we ask people, have you traveled to Africa? Have you been around someone who's traveled to Africa recently? Because infectious diseases travel with people as they travel. Okay, let's take a look at a PowerPoint. Okay, folks, here it is. Schistosomiasis. Is that too hard for you to say? How about this? Bilharzia. No, let's use snail fever or Katayama fever. Schistosomiasis is a disease caused by a parasitic worm, gross, of the schistosoma type. So this is a flatworm. I don't think any of you have probably ever seen worms like this, but they're flatworms that get into the body. There are 5 different types of these flatworms. They all cause schistosomiasis, but there's Schistosoma japonicum, there's Schistosoma mansoni, there's Schistosoma hematabulum, there's Schistosoma intercalatum, and there's Schistosoma macangi. They all cause schistosomiasis, but the difference is that they all live in a certain snail in the water that's different, a different type of snail. Now you might say to me, well, why do we care if it infects snails? Well, the schistosome the schistosoma worm lives in the snail for a certain amount of time, almost like you live in your mom's womb. And then it comes out of the snail into the water. And when people are in the water swimming, fishing, gathering water to drink, to bathe, to wash clothes, this worm can get into their skin, particularly if they have open sores on their feet. Okay? So let's take a look at these disgusting worms. Here they are. These are pictures of the adult worm, except here the makongi is in a larval stage. You can see that it has kind of a hook on the end, and that's how it gets onto you, and then it burrows its way into you. Okay, so how do you get schistosomiasis? Well, first of all, you become infected with a schistosoma worm, usually 4 to 6 weeks prior to when you start to get symptoms. And so you don't know it, just like now COVID, they say you can be exposed to 2 weeks before you start to get the fever or illness. So it is with schistosomiasis. It's a month to a month and a half before you start to have symptoms. And this particular part of the life cycle, the cercaria, reach the portal vein several days after infection. And then you start to get this toxic schistosomiasis 6 to 8 weeks after you get the infection. And then it affects your urinary system 10 to 12 weeks after. Now, these worms, once they reach an adult size, can live inside your body for 20 to 30 years and completely wreak havoc on your body. So eggs hatch releasing myristidia or larvae, and the myristidia get into the snail tissue. And then the snail releases cercaria. And then the cercaria become free swimming, lose their tail, and get into humans. Let's take a look at this. It'll make more sense when we do. Okay? And here's more about what happens once they get into the human body. But let's take a look at this photo. This is really, really important. We're going to start down here, okay? At number 1. If a person is infected with schistosomiasis, in their feces and in their urine, they have eggs, okay? And these eggs come out in the feces and urine of these infected individuals and get into the water supply. In very poor places, usually in the continent of Africa, where there is not good sanitation and where there is not good treatment for urine and feces, and people frequently urinate or go to the bathroom close to a body of water, this gets into the water. And then the eggs hatch. So the eggs that are in the urine and feces of infected people get into the water and hatch. And they release this thing called a myristidia. Now, a myristidia will not go into a human. So if you're standing in the water filled with this myristidia, it's not going to go into a human being. It first has to go into these snails. Once it's inside the snail, that's when trouble happens. Because inside the snail, it matures. It gets into a stage called the cercaria. And the cercaria is then released by the snail. We see that it has a tail, which it loses, it's free swimming, and then it penetrates into, so here we see it loses its tail and it penetrates into the human being. Once it gets into the human being, it migrates up to the portal vein, this large vein that feeds your liver, and it goes into the liver and it matures to an adult. So this is happening between the 4 and 6 weeks when a person becomes infected with schistosomes but doesn't know they have. And then what happens is these adults pair together and they lay eggs that are then shed out into the urine and the feces of individuals. So there you see the life cycle of it. Okay, and I want to stop here and take a look at another really terrific photo. And we'll come back to this. But let's see if we can get this other photo up. I'm going to stop sharing that screen, share another screen. This is what I wanted you to look at, which may help to explain some of what we've been talking about, okay? Number one, unfortunately, in places that do not have good sanitation, we have people urinating and defecating close to water. These are individuals who are sick with schistosomiasis, and so there are eggs from the schistosome worm in their feces and urine. These eggs get deposited into the water and they hatch, releasing the larval stage. What we say by larval stage is almost like the stage that you would be in as a fetus before you're even born. So this larval stage, or merocydia, are now released into the water as the eggs that are in the urine and feces of infected people hatch. Now, again, the very important thing to remember about the merocydia, or these merocydium in groups, they only go into snails. Here's where they reproduce and they release cercaria. Now the cercaria we see comes with a tail. Now he's moving around, and this gentleman here is fishing. And the cercaria lose their tail, penetrate an open sore on his foot, and now they go up into the portal vein and go into his liver and become adults. So a key here is, if there's no snail to take this larval stage and release the cercaria, there's nowhere for these eggs to hatch, these merocydium. There's nowhere for the merocydium to go. The merocydium will not go into a human. It has to go into a snail, and then it has to become a cercaria with a tail. So the snail is a very, very, very important part here. And I want to be clear that this is fresh water, not salt water like our oceans. This is fresh water, okay? So keep in mind this cycle. Someone who has the disease is releasing eggs in their urine and feces. The egg is then coming into the water and releasing a merocydium. The merocydium is then going into a snail, and it is reproducing and becoming a cercaria, and the cercaria is then coming out of the snail and has a tail, and then it's going to lose its tail and penetrate into an adult human. Go up in the portal vein and live in the liver until it becomes an adult. Then these adults are going to mate, and we're going to have eggs. And then the eggs are going to come out in the urine and feces. Okay? So this is how this parasite is surviving and thriving in the human body of those unfortunate enough to be infected with it. But what happens? Well, we know that it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for you to start feeling ill. And a fever is definitely part of this. That's why it's called snail fever, okay? Heavy infestations cause you to have big swollen lymph nodes and to have fevers. And of course, your liver gets enlarged because your liver is where all these worms are going to grow up into adults. The place where it invaded into your skin can itch and give you a rash. This can be very deadly. Now what happens is as it begins to clog up your liver and get into your intestines, you can get bloody diarrhea. It also, these adult worms love to go into your bladder and to give you dysuria and cystitis and blood in your urine. And I don't know if you've ever had a bladder infection, the pain that that comes from. These are the adult worms, okay? They've come up as cercaria. They've come into the portal vein, they've come into your liver, they're growing into adults, they're mating, they're making more eggs, they're hatching more worms, and away we go. And now they're wreaking havoc in your body. As you can imagine, there's gastrointestinal bleeding, there's obstruction as these worms start to live in your colon. There's malnutrition because as things start to live in your colon, you can't absorb nutrients. There's neuropathy, they live in your nerves. There's kidney failure. There's infections in your bladder and kidneys. There's blood in your urine, that's hematuria. There's bladder cancers then. Like we said, these worms can live 20 and 30 years. So you have this chronic inflammation of your bladder, you can get bladder cancer. If they go into your lungs, they can give you pulmonary hypertension. They can give you paralysis. They can get into your brain and give you like mini strokes and micro infarcts. They can give you pulmonary hypertension or high pressure in your lungs. They can give you infection, a widespread total body infection. They can make you infertile. If you're pregnant when you get it, you can have a low birth weight baby or spontaneously lose your baby. They can give you end organ disease or failure. Of course, they can give you all of these problems, cancer of the liver, the bladder, the gallbladder, particularly if you have this for many, many years. So here's the way we screen and test for it, which is quite obvious. We have to look at urine samples and stool samples and water samples. But how do we treat this? Well, this is what I will say is one of the great things about schistosomiasis. It is treated by an anti-parasitic medication called praziquantel. And praziquantel is very, very cheap. It's very easy to use. It's very readily available, and it has very few side effects. This is good news. Sometimes we need to use steroids to treat some of the other symptoms. But interestingly enough about praziquantel, depending on which type of schistosomiasis worm you have, it could be 40 milligrams per day orally in 2 divided doses or 60 milligrams per kilogram per day. And here's a picture of it, praziquantel. Its side effects are very minimal compared to the damage schistosomiasis can do. So how can we prevent it? Well, avoid swimming or wading in fresh water, especially when you have open wounds and cuts and when the water is not safe or near a place where people use the water to go to the bathroom, to urinate, or to go to have a bowel movement. Drinking safe water. You can also ingest dirty water with these flatworms. Always boil and filter the water before bathing, before ingesting, drinking, cleaning clothes, cooking, okay? So here's what some communities ended up doing because it was so widespread. They ended up giving praziquantel to all of the school-age children. And they worked on improving sanitation, teaching people that to use the bathroom, you must go far away from the water because we don't want what is in your feces and your urine to get into the water. And it's not just schistosomiasis, it's many. Here's some pictures of what schistosomiasis can look like. This individual has the schistosomiasis. Here you see it has completely blocked their portal vein, and so they are getting large venous protrusions. And you see here, this is a blockage of the colon. This is a young girl who's had schistosomiasis for many, many years, and it's led to this large, large abdomen. And this is because there's a blockage of her portal vein and also the malnutrition. And I can tell you why I know she's malnourished. For one thing, if you look at her arm here and her arm here, you can see that she has much less muscle mass and subcutaneous fat in this picture, even though she's older. The same is true for her thigh. You see here that she has much less muscle and subcutaneous fat as an older child than she did as a younger one. I also see here that she's beginning to develop breast buds, which is a sign of her maturity and reaching puberty. But here I see that's regressed. And this large abdomen is a collection of fluid we call ascites because her liver has been so damaged by these adult schistosoma worms. Okay? All right. So we're going to move on from that. And talk a little bit about another way we have tried to treat schistosomiasis. The World Health Organization has tried to treat schistosomiasis, thinking very smartly, by saying, how can we stop the worm from getting into the human? Well, we can stop it from getting into the snail because it has to go into the snail first and develop and become a cercadia and then come out and go into the adult. So what if we wipe out the entire snail population? What if we put something in the water that kills off all the snails, and then therefore these eggs that come out of people who are sick with schistosomiasis and release that initial larval stage that goes into the snail? What if we cut the snail out? This essential middle thing that it has to come from the human as an egg, go into the snail, come out of the snail, go into the, what if we take out the snail and then there's no way for this worm to develop into its next stage that where it can affect the human? Well, actually communities have tried that. And what we find out and what we know from environmental science and ecology and ecosystems is that when you remove one thing from the ecosystem, you wreak havoc on the balance of nature. So whatever fed on the snails dies off, whatever the snails ate grows in abundance. We are changing the ecosystem of the fresh water, making it dangerous for fish, making it uninhabitable for other fish. And so therefore the fish that you go to fish to survive, to live and eat off are no longer there in the fresh water. We also know that whatever we use to kill off the snail can have toxic effects on other living things inside the fresh water. So good thought to eliminate what we call a vector. And I don't know if you've ever heard that word. If you have, it's probably been in math. But a vector is something that transmits the disease to the human. For instance, like in EEE, Eastern equine encephalitis, it's the mosquito. The mosquito brings the infection to the human being. And that's why we try to get rid of the mosquitoes, because we know they carry infection. Think about Lyme disease. In Lyme disease, it's usually deer that carry the tick. And then, so if we eliminate the deer and we try to cut down on the deer population, we have fewer and fewer ticks. Okay, that is a lot of information about one of the world's leading parasitic infections, schistosomiasis. I want to tell you two stories about schistosomiasis. When my daughter went to Africa in 2005, she saw many people with schistosomiasis. It is still a prevalent disease, and it is still a very hard disease to treat. And even though I tell you that the anti-parasitic drug is very cheap and very effective, the praziquantel, it is not always readily available. There is no CVS pharmacy that many people can go to get this medication. And sadly, we know that access to healthcare and life-saving medication is not ubiquitous or equitable in our country or in the world. So one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that when I was a resident, I was in the emergency room to see a man they thought had a gallbladder attack. But what he actually had was schistosomiasis. He had just recently immigrated from Africa, and he knew he had schistosomiasis, and he tried to tell them that I have an infection. And they said, yes, you do. It's in your gallbladder. It's because you have gallstones. But he didn't have gallstones. He had these worms. And what he needed was praziquantel and not an operation. But he told me that he used to pull the worms out. Sometimes the worms would come out of his skin, and he would make a small incision and see the worm close to the skin, make a small incision and get the worm to wrap around a matchstick. And every day he'd turn the matchstick and pull the worm out further from inside his skin. And so I asked him, why don't you just grab a tweezer and pull the worm out? And he said, because it'll snap in half and the rest of the worm will go back in. So many times, people who live in areas that are endemic with these diseases that we don't see a lot of in the United States have their own methods of treatment. And it's often helpful to ask them, how have you treated it? How have you survived? How have others in your village or where you live survived without medication? How do you treat this? And eventually he did treat it, and he was cured, but he had to stay away and quarantine from his entire family because as he was shedding the worms in his feces and urine, sometimes they were moving around in the toilet bowl, or eggs were coming out in his urine or in his stool, and he would have been able to transmit the disease to anybody else. He had to not use public restrooms. He had to quarantine for 4 to 6 weeks, and he had to wait to see if he infected anyone in his family. Those are just 2 stories about schistosomiasis. It is a very interesting disease, and even though we don't see it much in the United States, when we captured and enslaved and brought over Africans in the Middle Passage to our country, we brought over this disease. And particularly in the conditions that we brought these individuals over in, the spread of the disease was rampant. That's all. Please go to Flipgrid, answer the prompt, and create your own video. Thanks.